Well, all right. Well, welcome, one and all, to the 23rd Brattleboro Literary Festival. I'm Tom Bedell, part of the festival organizing committee, here to say for the first time today that this year's festival is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, Brattleboro Community Television, the Stepansky Family Trust, the Vermont Humanities Council, and Poets and Writers. We also appreciate our program advertisers, and we encourage you to support them. This particular session is sponsored by the Richards Group, and we most certainly thank them. And it's also, if everything's working properly, being sent live over YouTube today, just to make us more nervous, I guess. The festival's run entirely by volunteers. It's all free to attend, but not free to produce. So we urge you, almost to the point of begging, to slip a little something in the donation boxes you'll see at the various venues sometime this weekend, or use the QR code you'll see in these cards on one side, and you can take a survey on the other side. Please take a moment now to turn off the ringers on your phones if you haven't already. Some of you haven't, I see. But feel free to use it to take photos and spread them through the known social media universe. Lastly, sorry to say that Harold Holzer has fallen ill, so the session that was to immediately follow this one has been canceled. We just wish Harold a quick recovery. And best wishes to Matthew Delmont, who also had to cancel for family health reasons. That session was scheduled for tomorrow, 12:30 at Brooks Memorial Library. So, I usually have two books going at home. I've got a living room book, I've got a bedroom book, and if it's time to review some golf books, something I do, there might be a few more floating around there somewhere. So when I started reading Jeffrey Rosen's The Pursuit of Happiness, how classical writers on virtue inspired the lives of the founders and defined America, I confess I thought it might be heavy going. Spoiler alert, it's not. If anyone can write interestingly and compellingly about the Declaration of Independence and classical writers, it's our guest this morning. He's the president and CEO of the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, where he hosts the weekly We the People podcast. You may have heard him on NPR or read him in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the New Republic, the Atlantic, or in any of his previous 7 books, I believe, including conversations with RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, on life, love, liberty, and law. Or maybe you took a class with him, if you happen to have attended the George Washington University Law School, where he's a professor of law. Nonetheless, as a potential antidote, I chose as my upstairs book Andy Borowitz's Profiles in Ignorance: How America's Politicians Got Dumb and Dumber. And I have to say, this was a brilliant pairing on my part. Downstairs, I was reading about the astonishing brilliance of the founding fathers and a few mothers, their reading habits, wide and deep and steeped in classical and then modern philosophical works. Meantime, my nighttime reading was like traversing an almost infinite gulf from the heights of erudition to the sordid depths of our modern leaders' brainlessness, a vacuity that they've somehow managed to turn into a virtue. So Borowitz's book is funny, but it's also infuriating. Jeffrey Rosen's book is more enlightening, but also a bit puzzling. The Pursuit of Happiness was not, in the founders' minds, about pursuing pleasure. Actually, quite the opposite. It was about restraint, the curbing of the passions, the pursuit of virtue. And what's puzzling is that for all their striving, their pursuit of virtue, for all their intelligence and idealistic writings and rhetoric, most of them remained enslavers of other human beings. The hypocrisy is almost unexplainable, perhaps no more so than on Thomas Jefferson's part. But if anyone can explain it, we've got the man right here. Please welcome Jeffrey Rosen.
It is so wonderful to be with you, members of the congregation. I am delighted to be here in beautiful Brattleboro to talk with you about the pursuit of happiness and to make sure the mic works. So let's do that. Perfect. All you have to do is turn it on. Excellent. I want to tell you how I came on the unusual COVID-era reading project that led me to explore what the founders meant when they used those famous words, the pursuit of happiness. And I want to tell you what I learned from the reading and how it changed my life. It changed my understanding of how to be a good person and also how to be a good citizen, and most importantly, how to be a good and deep reader. So here's how it happened. It was during COVID that I recognized two unexpected synchronicities. Both Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin had drafted lists of 12 or 13 virtues for daily living, and both chose as their mottos a book by Cicero that I'd never heard of called the Tusculan Disputations. And the motto that Franklin chose was, "Without virtue, happiness cannot be." Now, I knew about Franklin's effort in his 20s to achieve moral perfection. He writes about it in his autobiography. Some of you may have heard of this project. He made a list of 12 virtues: order, sincerity, resolution, temperance, cleanliness. He later he chose the one he found hardest for last, and that was humility. And he made a graph with the virtues on the x-axis and the days of the week on the y-axis. And each week he resolved to focus on a different virtue and to put an X mark in the box when he fell short. He tried this for a while. He found it was incredibly depressing because there were so many X marks. And he eventually gave it up, but he felt that he was a better person for having tried. And I knew about the project. As it happened, I practiced it because a rabbi in Washington, D.C. recommended to a friend and I the Hebrew version of Franklin's 13 virtues. It's called Musar, or character improvement. Basically, a Hasidic rabbi in 1818 translated Franklin's virtues into Hebrew. And the friend and I tried it without knowing it came from Benjamin Franklin. We also found it's extremely depressing. And we also gave it up, but felt that this exercise of self-examination was improving. What I noticed during COVID was that Cicero motto, "Without virtue, happiness cannot be." A few weeks later, I was at the Boar's Head Inn in Charlottesville, Virginia, on the UVA campus, and there on the wall of the hotel room was a list of 12 virtues that Jefferson drafted for his daughters. And they were very similar to Franklin's. Resolution, resolve to do what you ought and do what you resolve. Silence, when angry, count to 10, when very angry, 100. Jefferson left one of Franklin's 13 virtues off his list, maybe because he didn't want to even raise the topic, and that was chastity. What really struck me is to learn that when Jefferson was asked when he was old about the secret of happiness, he would send a passage from Cicero's Tusculan Disputations. And he'd copied it out in his commonplace book when his dad died when he was 14. And until he was old, he thought this represented the essence of happiness. And it said, "He who has achieved a tranquility of soul, who is neither unduly exuberant or unduly despondent, he is the self-composed man of whom we are in quest. He is the wise and happy man." Okay, so I thought, I must read this Cicero book because it inspired both Franklin and Jefferson to define happiness as virtue rather than pleasure, as being good rather than feeling good. But what else to read? Then I found this golden reading list that Jefferson would send to kids who were going to law school or anyone who asked him how to be educated when he was old. And it's an astonishing list. It's remarkable both for its range and for the rigor of the schedule that it prescribes. It includes novels and poetry and history. I was drawn to the section that Jefferson sometimes called natural religion and sometimes ethics. And at the top of the list was Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, and then Cicero's On Duties, and then other classical Greek and Roman moral philosophers, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, Seneca's Letters, Epictetus, and Enlightenment philosophers like John Locke, Francis Hutcheson, Lord Bolingbroke, and David Hume. What struck me, especially about this list, is that I'd never read any of the books. I've had a marvelous liberal arts education, and I'm so grateful every day to the incredible teachers in high school and college and law school who taught me English. I was an English major in college, and history and political philosophy and law. But despite all of these wonderful teachers, and I missed these books of moral philosophy because they'd fallen out of the curriculum when I was in high school and college in the 1980s. And I remember yearning for this kind of guidance. I grew up in New York City. My folks had a place in upstate New York, in Saugerties, New York, where my sister and I still go. And I was looking for an alternative both to the greed is good ethos, which was kind of embodied in the New York City mentality, and then the sex, drugs, and rock and roll of Saugerties and Woodstock in the 80s. An alternative essentially to the hedonism and materialism that was kind of celebrated by popular culture. And what I didn't realize, because this ancient wisdom had fallen out of the culture, is that this is exactly what the ancients provided. A guide to how to live a purpose-driven life that didn't depend either on hedonism or on pure religious authority and faith. It was an effort to lead a purpose-driven life by reason and reflection, and it's the essence of the classical philosophy. What also struck me about Jefferson's list was the rigor of the schedule he prescribed. You had to get up every morning before dawn, read moral philosophy for 2 hours, watch the sunrise, then read political philosophy and history, then lunch, then science and astronomy and higher mathematics, then some dinner, then you're allowed some Shakespeare and poetry, and then to bed, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, no breaks. So I don't know what got into me, but it was COVID, and we had some more time, and I was kind of daunted by the reading list. I felt this is a gap in my education that I had to fill. So I followed the Jefferson schedule. I got up every morning, I read moral philosophy for 2 hours, I watched the sunrise, and then I found myself writing sonnets to sum up the essence of the wisdom every morning, which I know seems incredibly weird, and I'd never imagined doing this, but I was just moved to write these sonnets. My wife, Lauren, is here. She's a poet, and she had inspired me to write poetry before this project started. And then my friend Barry Edelstein posted a YouTube video, how to write a Shakespeare sonnet. So I learned the form, which is the meter is easy enough, and there are 3 stanzas, and there's a volta or turn in the last stanza. So that's what I did. And I spent a year reading these marvelous books and writing these sonnets. And what I learned came as a revelation. First, the substance of what I learned, that for the founders, indeed, happiness was not feeling good, it was being good. It was not the pursuit of immediate pleasure, but the pursuit of long-term virtue. And by virtue, the founders meant self-mastery, self-improvement, character improvement, being your best self, using your powers of reason to moderate or restrain your unreasonable passions or emotions. I learned that this distinction between reason and passion, which is everywhere in the political and moral philosophy, came of all people from Pythagoras. Who knew that in addition to inventing the triangle and the harmonic system, if that weren't enough, Dayenu, as the Jews say at Passover, he also invented classical moral philosophy and imagined that we have certain faculties or powers with reason in the head and passion in the heart and desire in the stomach. And our task, our quest, is to use our powers of reason to moderate or modulate our unreasonable passions or desires so we can achieve that calm tranquility and self-composure that Cicero identified as the essence of wisdom and happiness and truth and alignment with the divine. The ancients don't think that we should lack emotion, far from it. Instead, we should master our unproductive passions and emotions. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg told me when I had the honor of writing this book with her, collecting our conversations, that her mom told her when she was young, overcome unproductive emotions like anger, jealousy, and fear. They'll distract you from focus and from productive work. And that's the essence of the classical learning as well. Her mom got it from Stoic readings when she was in New York public school on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. The idea is to resist our immediate impulses so we can serve our long-term interests. In a sense, it's a version of the marshmallow test, which you may remember from the Stanford researchers in the 70s, who offered very young kids at about 5 years old 1 marshmallow if they insisted on having it immediately, or 2 if they could wait for 15 minutes. And the kids who could wait did much better later in life. They had better outcomes in school and thrived more generally. And remarkably, that is the essence of all of the moral writings, the classical philosophers and the Christian writers and Blackstone and the Whig theorists and the classical Republican revolutionary theorists who inspired the founders all see virtue as a form of self-mastery and resisting our immediate impulses to achieve our long-term well-being. And that's what I learned, and it was indeed a revelation. Now, I have to share that the most meaningful takeaway from this whole unusual project was just rediscovering the habits of daily reading. I had fallen out of the habit of reading for stuff that wasn't related to immediate deadlines or work. And I read in high school and college, obviously, when I had to, but I just had stopped doing it. And it was so stretching, so meaningful, such a source of light and learning that I've kept up the habit. And I'm not catching the sunrise every morning, I have to say, but I do have a rule that when I wake up, I'm not allowed to browse or surf until I've read. And it's a struggle every morning because I read on the Kindle and I take out my phone and I'm tempted to swipe right to the email and not left, but I don't allow myself to do that, thinking of Ben Franklin and Pythagoras smiling down on me. And it's just, it's a miracle. You read a book every morning and you learn something wonderful and new. And I've just finished a new book on how the battle between Hamilton and Jefferson defined all of American history, which was a marvelous project. And it's just such a source of happiness, of meaning, of growth, that I recommend it. And I come to you as an evangelist for the power of radical deep reading. And I know you're all readers because you're here at the Brattleboro Book Festival and you've shown up here. And just making it a practice, a daily habit, is for me and for the founders a source of growth and really a spiritual quest as well, because the pursuit of happiness, as defined by the ancient sources, was very much an attempt to align with the divine harmonies of the universe, to use our talents to the best of our ability, to exercise not just the right, but the responsibility to develop our faculties of reason so that we could be our best self and serve others. There's a beautiful phrase from Louis Brandeis, the great Supreme Court Justice, in Whitney versus California, the greatest free speech opinion ever written. And Brandeis has just read Jefferson's Virginia Declaration of Rights, and he's channeling Jefferson paragraph by paragraph. And he says, those who won our revolution, speaking of Jefferson and the revolutionaries of '76, believed that the final end of the state was to make men free to develop their faculties, and in its government the deliberative forces prevailed over the arbitrary. They valued freedom both as an end and as a means. They believed the secret of happiness to be freedom and freedom to be self-mastery. They believed that freedom to think as you will and speak as you think, that's a quotation from Tacitus, were means indispensable to the discovery and spread of political truth, that without free speech and assembly, discussion would be futile, that with them discussion affords ordinarily adequate protection against the dissemination of noxious doctrine, that the greatest threat to freedom is an inert people, that public discussion is a political duty, and that this should be a fundamental principle of the American government. It's a remarkable distillation of the classical and Enlightenment faith in reason, and you heard that language about how developing your faculties of reason isn't only a right, but a duty of citizenship. And that's because for the founders, personal self-government was necessary for political self-government, unless citizens took the time to develop their faculties, to learn about the basic principles of the Constitution, to prevent themselves from exercising their angriest tweet and to own the libs and own the conservatives. We descend into faction, and demagogues and violence would be the result. I came to understand from my reading the deep connection between the founders' quest for personal and public happiness, as they called it, and their belief that unless all of us as individuals took the time to improve ourselves through deep reading, then the result might be violence and the fall of the Republic. So that's why this is both an opportunity and a responsibility. Now the book tells the stories of the founders and their efforts to live up to these high ideals, as well as their failures. And it's remarkable how much time the founders took discussing their own efforts to achieve self-mastery, their anxieties, their angst, their neuroses. I thought that having a Jewish mom was tough. It turns out that having a Puritan mom in Abigail Adams is even tougher, because poor John Quincy Adams was constantly beating himself up for not working hard enough and not using his faculties of reason. And when he's 30 years old, he's just been appointed to the Supreme Court and turned down the appointment. He's minister to St. Petersburg, and he says, I'm 30 years old, I haven't achieved anything. If only I had more self-discipline, if only I wasn't wasting my time going to the theater and drinking and eating too much, I might have ended war and slavery. He set a very high bar for himself. But he's constantly resolving to read more and drink less, and as it happened, he is among the most inspiring of all the founders because he was so mindful in his quest for self-mastery. He had two great setbacks in midlife. He loses re-election for the presidency, and his oldest son, George Washington Adams, commits suicide. He can't deal with the burden of that remarkable name. He descends into alcoholism. He jumps off a steamship. Adams is devastated. How can he go on? What does he do? He reads Cicero in the original, again, in particular, the Tusculan Disputations, which is his favorite book. And in fact, he takes his own motto from the Tusculan Disputations: I plant for the benefit of future generations, not expecting the seeds to blossom in my lifetime. And based on his year-long reading of Cicero and the Bible, Adams both writes a series of remarkable sonnets. It turns out there's something in this literature that commands it to be summed up or distilled in harmonic or beautiful form, and Adams wrote these incredible sonnets of freedom. And then he converts himself into the greatest abolitionist of his age. And he, based on his own close reading of the Bible, in particular a passage that says that Jesus promised to free the captives, concludes that slavery violates the Bible and natural law, and he crusades against slavery. And he introduces a constitutional amendment to end slavery. And he denounces the gag rule in Congress, which forbids the reading of abolitionist petitions. And he dies on the floor of Congress after voting against the Mexican War. He's carried to a couch, and his last whispered words are, "I am composed." And he gets that from Cicero. Remember that passage Jefferson sent? "A composed man is he who is happy and wise." Adams believes that finally, having mastered his passion and composed himself for virtuous death, he's embodying the Stoic ideal. It's this extraordinarily inspiring, mindful, purpose-driven life, and he's such a hero that Frederick Douglass calls him the greatest white defender of freedom in that period. Adams gets it from his parents, John and Abigail. And their courtship is one of the most beautiful and inspiring in American letters. It's full of romantic and intellectual partnership. And what do they do when they meet? John and Abigail meet cute, I guess you'd say. They decide to make a list of each other's faults. Because they've read Pythagoras. They have the Pythagoras golden virtues, and so you're supposed to make an accounting of your faults every night. So they make their list, and John knows that his fault is a lack of humility, because he's one of the most famously self-regarding men of his age. He wants the president to be called His Elective Majesty, and he's kind of mocked as his rotundity, and people, from the musical 1776, I'm obnoxious and disliked that cannot be denied. That everyone knows that he's constantly denouncing the fact that he's not getting enough credit for the revolution. It was really Adams who came up with the Declaration. Jefferson's getting all the credit. He speaks of himself in the third person. Anyway, that's his fault. But Abigail's very gentle. She says, well, your fault is you're so intellectually intimidating that some people might possibly think that you were a little bit arrogant. But, of course you're not. And he reciprocates by saying, well, your faults are that you are not practicing the piano enough and you're not reading enough, plus you're pigeon-toed. And she says, well, I'll try to practice more and read more, but a gentleman shouldn't comment on a lady's posture. But I'm bummed. So they have this beautiful friendship, and they're constantly telling John Quincy to master his passions. And Abigail's favorite proverb is, he who is slow to anger is greater than he who's taken a village, showing the deep connection between the Hebrew Bible and this literature of self-mastery. And as for John, although he is indeed arrogant, he wears his heart on his sleeve, and he's so relatable, and you can't help love him because he's always beating himself up for losing his temper, or for not working hard enough, or for not reading enough Burlamaqui. When his parents have a marital spat, he goes into the other room and reads Cicero to console himself. Who wouldn't love that? And the fact is that although he has these titanic battles, he ultimately makes up with his antagonist, most notably with Thomas Jefferson. And the story of their fight and their reconciliation is among the most important and beautiful in American politics. This is an extraordinarily challenging time for America. The election of 1800 was a similar time. The Union might have collapsed after the disputed election of 1800. Burr and Jefferson tie. Hamilton persuades the Federalists to cast a tie-breaking vote for Jefferson, whom he despises, but thinks that Burr is a demagogue who would threaten to bring down the Republic like Caesar on horseback. Burr kills Hamilton. Adams and Jefferson split over the rise of their two political parties, and after 10 years, they reconcile. Abigail sends Jefferson a lock of her hair, and they begin to write to each other. Adams sends a copy of John Quincy Adams' Boylston Lectures on Classical Rhetoric, which is his peace offering. And when they begin to correspond again, what do they want to talk about? Classical philosophy and comparative spirituality. And Adams is so excited when he learns that Pythagoras may have traveled to the east and read the Hindu Vedas. And he's convinced that if this could be proven, it will be shown that the central lesson of the Eastern and Western philosophies are the same, and that Pythagoras took his philosophy of self-mastery from the Hindu injunction, renounce and enjoy. Renounce attachment to external events and enjoy eternal bliss. Gandhi quoted that phrase. And Adams sensitively notes that the similarities between the wisdom of the East, the Dhammapada says we are what we think, life is shaped by the mind, and the central Stoic lesson called the dichotomy of control. Abandon efforts to control the thoughts and action of others, which you can't control. Focus on the only things you can control, which are your own thoughts and emotions. And Adams, through his deep reading, sees that connection. He's just not sure whether Joseph Priestley, who's writing a comparison between the philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita and the West, has lived long enough to complete it. And Jefferson says, good news, he lived, I'll send you the book. And Adams is so excited, both about the effort, the opportunity to get this book, and about the fact that he says that this will show the central moral connection between the philosophies of the East and West, which Adams sums up in what he calls the hymn of Cleanth: love God and all his creatures, rejoice in all things. It's this deep, remarkable exercise in moral reflection. And Jefferson responds that after his long life, he's concluded that he's no longer a Stoic, but is now an Epicurean. But by that, he doesn't mean hedonism or wanton pleasure-seeking. That's a libel on Epicurus by his Stoic enemies. In fact, says Jefferson, the true Epicurus counsel that we rationally contract our desires so that we can meet them. And rather than seeking after externals like wealth or fame, we focus on trying to achieve self-mastery, which is within our control. So after it's such a deep journey on Jefferson's part, and that's his mature reflection. It's just a beautiful expression of friendship with these two men. At the end of the correspondence, Jefferson says, "I know little after my long life except that I love you with all my heart." Beautiful expression of love by an extremely self-composed, opaque, and elusive character who rarely reveals his emotions. And they're bonding over their deep love of reading and of America. This raises the question that we heard in the introduction. What about Jefferson and slavery? How is it possible that the great author of the Declaration, who insisted that all men are created equal, himself was a notorious enslaver, always insisting that slavery should end at some point in the distant future, but never lifting a finger to disrupt his own lifestyle to make that possible? And the answer I found is that far from trying to defend this hypocrisy, Jefferson and his fellow enslavers of this generation didn't even try. I found a remarkable passage by Patrick Henry, who's just given the "Give me liberty or give me death" speech, quoting Addison's Cato, his favorite play. And then Henry says, "Is it not amazing that I myself, who believe that slavery violates the Bible and natural law, myself own slaves? I will not justify it, I won't attempt to. It's simple avarice or greed. I can't do with the inconvenience of living without it." Remarkable, isn't it? I know that it's wrong, I just don't want to give up the lifestyle that it makes possible. And that moment of brutal candor showed the fact that they recognized their own hypocrisy. They liked the lifestyle and didn't want to give it up, even though they knew it was wrong. And no one more than Jefferson, who is always exhorting the virtues of industry and frugality, all the while living at Monticello like a Caligulan emperor, going into ruinous debt, buying French furniture, and indulging in a lifestyle made possible not only by enslaved labor, but by the labor of his own children, by Sally Hemings. And of course, he's surrounded in the house itself by Hemings, by Euston and Beverly Hemings, his own kids, by Sally Hemings. She agreed to come back from Paris on the condition that he free their kids when he died. He keeps that promise, but he frees no other members of his enslaved populations except for his own children and a few other members of the Hemings family. And the philosopher who makes the avoidance of debt the centerpiece of his political and personal philosophy, who says that the earth lives in usufruct for the living, says that one generation can't impose debts on another, and there should be a constitutional convention every 19 years so that people can rethink anew their commitment to the Constitution. His debts are so crushing that his entire plantation has to be sold, including the enslaved souls who are part of it, and parents are separated from kids, and his daughters are crushed with debt despite all of his denunciations of it. It's a hypocrisy is the only word for it. Jefferson's hypocrisy is made even worse by his virulent racism, and I must say how jarring it was to read about his encounters with the great Phyllis Wheatley, the first published black poet, who comes over enslaved to the United States. Her master and mistress, for some reason, allow her to be educated along with their kids in the classics, in classical moral philosophy, and she writes poems of virtue, exhorting the virtues of self-mastery and the immorality of slavery. They're praised by Washington and by Franklin. The city of Boston decides to hold a trial on whether or not she wrote her own poems, saying that they're so great, how could she have written them? And in this remarkable exercise, a group of Boston worthies, presided over by John Hancock, the guy who signed the Declaration, along with Cotton and Increase Mather and so forth, examined Phyllis Wheatley on her classical knowledge. Professor Henry Louis Gates imagines questions like, who is Apollo, and name the 9 muses. She passes with flying colors, and she's an international celebrity, the Oprah Winfrey of her day, according to Professor Gates. She goes to London, she gets the keys to the tower, she is received by the Duke and Duchess, and acclaimed all around, and there's just one dissenting voice, and that's Jefferson. And in his notes on the state of Virginia, he has a shocking chapter about how the poetry of Phyllis Whatley, he misspells her name, is beneath contempt because black poets are inferior to white poets, because black people are inferior to white people. And it's just a virulent racism not expressed by other founders of his day, including Franklin and Washington, and just a blot on the legacy of Jefferson in every way. So that is what I learned from reading about Jefferson and virtue. Contrast him with Washington, also an enslaver, although he does free his own enslaved population on his wife's death. Washington, if Jefferson becomes smaller on close examination, Washington appears greater. And he's constantly attempting to achieve self-mastery and not to lose his temper in public and to retain his composure. And he gets this, his great biographer, Ron Chernow thinks, possibly from his mom, who's always nagging him and telling him to, work harder. And it's the John Quincy Abigail problem that I know so well, too. But he is never seen to lose his temper in public, except once on the battlefield when his orders are disobeyed, and once when the Senate disrespects him. At all times, he has granite self-composure, most notably at Newburgh in 1784, when the soldiers are rebelling because they haven't been paid. They're demanding their back pay. They're in danger of mutiny. Washington mounts a wooden platform, no doubt like this one. It's called the Temple of Virtue. He has performed for the troops a version of Addison's Cato, his favorite play, praising the consolations of mild philosophy. And then Washington appeals to the troops for patience and temperance, the classical virtues, asking them to restrain themselves, and then he'll ensure that they're paid, and he struggles to read his speech, and he takes out his reading glasses, and he says, "Forgive me, gentlemen, I've grown old in your service, and now I've grown almost blind." And the soldiers weep. They've never seen him confess weakness before. And to see the great Washington so composed and so human is overwhelmingly moving. And that's the source of Washington's greatness, the greatest American of his time. There would have been no Constitution without him. He said little at the Constitutional Convention, but the fact that he showed up was a sign of his devotion to union. And the fact that everyone knew that he would be the first president allowed them to create a strong presidency. And at the end of his presidency, Washington, in his important farewell address, warns of the dangers of faction. And he's not sure the Republic is going to survive because of the new rise of the political parties, presided over by Hamilton for the Federalists and Jefferson for the Democratic Republicans. And Washington worries that, as in the past, Rome was riven by faction and Caesar came in on horseback and, taking advantage of the divisions, persuaded the people to surrender their liberty in exchange for cheap security and small luxuries, for bread and circus. Washington fears that our union, too, will fall unless we cleave to the principles of virtuous self-mastery and citizens take the time to educate themselves about the Constitution. And he endorses a national university for the study of politics and the Constitution, where people will come from around the country and set aside their partisan differences and their parochial and geographic divisions and learn the habits of civil dialogue and the principles of the Constitution. And that's what he thinks is necessary for the survival of the Republic, which he's not sure is going to work. And all of the founders were unsure. Washington fears faction. Hamilton thinks the president isn't strong enough. Adams wanted a stronger president as well. Jefferson properly fears civil war over slavery, trembling like a wolf in the night when he thinks about the coming conflict. Only Madison is a little more optimistic because he expects less. But Madison's whole faith is based on the power of the people to use reason to master their unreasonable passions. So I reread the Federalist Papers after reading this virtue literature, and in an entirely new light. Remember the Federalist Papers written by Madison and Hamilton to defend the ratification of the Constitution? It's a manual for public happiness. And Madison defines faction as any group, a minority or a majority, animated by passion rather than reason, devoted to self-interest rather than the public good. And Madison has studied faculty psychology and Pythagoras and classical moral philosophy at Princeton with President Witherspoon. And he thoughtfully and remarkably compares the harmony that we're supposed to achieve in our own constitutions with those we seek to achieve in the Constitution of the state. And just as individuals have a responsibility to use our powers of reason to moderate our unreasonable passions and desires, so the Constitution of the state is set up to balance passion in the and reason and desire in the president and Senate and House and judiciary, so that we can achieve a calm harmony through the separation of powers and checks and balances. And the classical wisdom had said you can only have republics in small territories where citizens know each other. But Madison says that's wrong for two reasons. We can have a representative republic, so there's no need for citizens to assemble in person as they did in Rome, and therefore you can avoid the problem of the 6,000 person assembly in Athens. Madison says, in all large assemblies of any character composed, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Even if every Athenian had been Socrates, Athens would still have been a mob, says Madison. And he's afraid of Shays' Rebellion in western Massachusetts, not far from here, where farmers are mobbing the federal bankruptcy courts because they can't pay their debts after the inflation that followed the war. And the whole Constitution is designed to prevent mobs from forming. And Madison is hopeful that the large size of America, combined with a representative system, will make it hard for mobs to discover each other, or by the time they do, they'll get tired and go home because it's so big and it's hard to organize. Now, for Madison, the whole system turns on the ability of citizens to deliberate thoughtfully and slowly rather than quickly and to form mobs. And that's why Madison is so optimistic about a new media technology, the broadside press, that will allow complicated arguments like the Federalist Papers to be published in the daily newspapers. And citizens can read them and discuss them with their representatives and thoughtfully deliberate and listen to differing points of view, and reason can slowly prevail. And he's especially excited about a new class of enlightened journalists and statesmen he calls the literati, a phrase he gets from Condorcet. And he imagines literati-like representatives and journalists like some kind of group of journalists from the Atlantic or something like that, discussing with citizens and having conversations, probably much like the one we're having here in this beautiful church, so that reason can slowly prevail. Friends, just to describe this Madisonian vision is to make obvious the gap between his hopes and our reality. And it's obvious that our media landscape of enraged to engage and tweets and twerks and TikTok and posts based on passion traveling further and faster than those based on reason is the opposite of the Madisonian ideal, and in fact is Madison's nightmare. And it's especially disturbing also to see how social media has undermined the benefits of size that Madison placed so much hope in, and now Twitter mobs and quick takes can form instantly, allowing factions to harden and representatives and journalists to play to their most enraged and mobilized bases. And that's why we're more polarized than at any time since the Civil War, and why the fears of faction that were so central to the founding seem more grave than ever. There is no easy solution to our current vexations, but the founders do point to the urgent responsibility that each of us as citizens has to educate ourselves about the principles of the Constitution. It is very striking how much responsibility they put on individual citizens to learn about constitutional principles, and how they thought that unless people studied history and saw how many republics have fallen to demagogues and the mob, history would repeat itself in America. I did find two remarkable letters from Hamilton and Jefferson, both warning of demagogues and the fall of the republic. Hamilton fears a Caesar on horseback who'll come in, flatter the people, and then subvert liberty after he's been popularly elected. His Caesar in embryo, 'tis Burr, he says. Burr, who has conspired to lead a Western insurrection that will lead the Western states to secede, and also conspired, according to trial testimony, to attack Washington, D.C., assassinate Jefferson. Burr reportedly said, hang Jefferson, and to install himself as the emperor of the new republic was all mooted during the Burr trial. That's Hamilton's fear, and that's why he votes for Jefferson over Burr, because he fears that he's a treasonous demagogue. Jefferson, too, fears Burr, prosecutes him for treason, but his great fear is not Caesar, who's elected and then installs himself for life, but as Jefferson says to Madison when he first receives a copy of the Constitution, I have two objections. First, there's no Bill of Rights, and second, the president is eligible for re-election, because I fear that in the future, without a one-year term limit, a president might lose an election by a few votes, cry foul, refuse to leave office, and install himself as a dictator. It's word for word, Jefferson to Madison on receiving a copy of the Constitution. So in other words, both Hamilton and Jefferson fear demagogues, which they think every republic has fallen to. Hamilton's solution is a life term for the president, like Cromwell was given after the British Revolution, not a hereditary monarchy, but a life term would spare the president the need to be a dictator because he didn't have to cling to power. And Jefferson's solution is a one-year term limit. We will, as President Trump so wisely says, we'll see what the future brings. And these are grave and contested times. But I want to end, if this is the right time for Q&A, as indeed it is, by sharing with you a remarkable speech that John Quincy Adams gave on the Jubilee of the Constitution in 1839. He fears the coming clouds of civil war. He gives a remarkable and deep account of the rise of political parties and the factions that have riven America, and the fact that the essence of America comes from the promise in the Declaration that we are one people, and that our rights deriving from God or nature rather than government lead us to secure those rights by forming governments by consent. And it is we, the people of the entire United States, who have created the Union, and therefore only the entire people can change or dissolve it. And then Adams says that what's going to determine whether or not we keep the Union is whether we learn these principles of the Declaration: liberty, equality, government by consent, and the principles of the Constitution: federalism, separation of powers, Bill of Rights, the rule of law. The rule of law is the one thing that has kept America throughout history, says Adams, from descending into violence. And history is a battle between power and principle, and only the Constitution and the rule of law prevent violence from opening. And John Adams, there's this amazing letter from John Adams to John Quincy, where John Adams says, I've been rereading the history plays of Shakespeare, from Richard II to Henry VI, and English history is the tale of how power unconstrained by principle descends into violence. Before the Magna Carta, before habeas corpus, it was blood and faction and the red rose against the white rose. And Adams said to John Quincy, I fear the same path in America. If a Hamilton or a Burr is empowered to come on horseback, we too may fall the way of the English. Only the Constitution and only a devotion to the rule of law will constrain us from descending into violence in the mob. And Quincy Adams channels that lesson from his dad in this amazing speech on the Jubilee of the Constitution, and says that's why it's so urgently important to learn about the Constitution and the Declaration. And then he quotes Deuteronomy. And Adams says in this amazing passage, he says that we must cleave to the Declaration and the Constitution, take these principles as frontlets between your eyes, place them upon your arms and upon your foreheads, put them above your doorposts, whisper them to your children before you sleep, make them the principles of your political salvation. That's how important it is to learn about the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution, and that's what the founders inspire us to do, and that's exactly what you are doing by coming here this morning. Thank you so much.
We've got time for questions. I'll come down with a mic. Anyone?
I'm not sure where to start. That was just remarkable. But do you think that the founders' ideal of an educated citizenry that could understand democracy, understand the Constitution, interact with their representatives in government was ever realistic, even in their time? I mean, could a farmer have time? Farmers can't read 2 hours before sunrise, but like, would they even be able to have the time to understand or interact in that way?
It's such an important question, and when you think about the fact that the founders' lifestyle was often made possible by enslaved laborers, you wonder whether it was really achievable on a broad scale. And they weren't sure. You know, Jefferson was very optimistic about the ability for education to diffuse widely. Adams, not so much. But for me, the most inspiring character of all in this regard is Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass learns his classical principles not from a fancy university, obviously, but on the streets of Baltimore. And the moment that he feels most shackled is not when his body is enchained, but when his wicked master forbids him from learning how to read. So he goes onto the streets of Baltimore, he buys reading lessons with bread from these boys who teach him how to read, and then he buys with bread this golden book, The Columbian Orator, just a little compilation of classical wisdom, the Stoics, Ben Franklin, and this dialogue on slavery that inspires him to become the greatest abolitionist of his time. And that's what fires his spirit. And he becomes this crusader, both for freedom and then after the war for self-reliance and education. And he just goes around talking about the urgent importance of the freedmen just being allowed to learn how to read, and he's convinced that given the opportunity, they will. So first, you know, if he could do that, like, it's just so, it's awe-inspiring. And for goodness sake, surely if Frederick Douglass, you know, had to buy reading lessons while escaping from his enslaved master, I can take the time to do my morning reading, you know, and we have such a privilege living in this world where all the books are free and online. And I do feel that that's an important benefit that we have for all the dangers of the internet. All the books are here. It just blows my mind. And this is a distraction source, but it's also the Library of Alexandria. And when I was a kid, I was so full of wonder when I went to the Library of Congress with my mom, the Thomas Jefferson building, which I think is the most beautiful in DC, with these inspiring pay-ins to the virtues of reading. I thought all the books in the world are in that one place, and now they're on our phones. So access is much easier than it was in their time. Online courses are amazing. I do have to put in a plug for the incredible resources of the National Constitution Center where I work, which has this extraordinary interactive constitution, which has now gotten 90 million hits and brings together liberal and conservative scholars for constitutional education. We've just launched this amazing new course with Khan Academy just a few weeks ago on the Khan platform. It's Khan's first civics course. You know, they do math and science, but it's a Constitution 101 class. It brings together the greatest legal scholars and historians in America, free and online with questions and courses. So check it out. It's great for adult learners too. But all this is to say that we have the ability to bring content and books and light to people on a scale that didn't exist before. And throughout history, there have been heroes like Douglass, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg's mom, who came over fleeing the murderous pogroms and in New York City public school, was such a reader that once she was walking along the Lower East Side and she broke her nose because it was buried in a book. And those kind of beautiful examples of people who have just achieved enlightenment through their own deep reading. And my own mom, I have to say, who graduated from New York City public schools the same year as Justice Ginsburg and had a similar education. It is striking to me how this moral philosophy has fallen out of the curriculum. It used to be central. These little books like the Columbian Orator or the McGuffey Reader were a central part of high school, college, middle school curriculum, and they fell out in the 1950s. And it is a reminder about how central this was to American education for so long, and how it might be good to resurrect some of it. Great question.
Another question. Might be worth mentioning that you, mostly about the founders, but you do have a chapter about Douglass and Lincoln.
Absolutely. And Justice Ginsburg and Brandeis.
Here we go.
What you say about the founders and the Constitution and the principles based on classical philosophy are wonderful. I wonder about some of the details which seem to, in this modern age, not really reflect where we are now as opposed to the agrarian, smaller society of the 1700s. I mean, I'm thinking of things like the Electoral College, the Senate, lifetime tenure of judges, things that now seem to some of us, many of us, as anti-democratic and perhaps not consistent with the principles. Do you have any hope of modernization of the Constitution in some of its details and updating it for modern times?
Great question. The Constitution Center did a really illuminating project called the Constitution Drafting Project 2 years ago, where we brought together some of the leading liberal, conservative, and libertarian scholars to draft constitutions from scratch. And what really surprised us is that far from throwing the whole thing out, many of them proposed amendments that looked so similar that we held a virtual convention on Zoom with these 9 scholars, 3 teams. And I listened in on the Zooms, and I felt like I was listening to modern founding fathers. That was the level of the debate was so high. And within a week, they just blew our minds by agreeing on 5 amendments to the Constitution. And these are serious conservatives and serious progressives who you wouldn't think would agree, but they did. And here are the amendments. First, term limits for Supreme Court justices. All of them agreed on 18-year term limits. Second, making amendment a little easier and impeachment a little harder in the House. Third, eliminating the natural-born citizenship requirement for president. And fourth, resurrecting the legislative veto, which allows Congress to repudiate executive action by majority vote. The Electoral College Amendment actually had surprising support from the progressives and the conservatives. It was nixed by the libertarians, whose basic principle was they wanted to add only one phrase after each part of the Constitution, and we mean it. They didn't want to add anything else. But there was surprising openness even to an electoral college amendment. And in fact, in 1972 or so, Birch Bayh proposed an electoral college amendment that would have passed if it got out of the Senate. It was endorsed by President Nixon and the Democrats and had overwhelming support in the country. It was vetoed by a couple of Southern congressmen in the Senate who wanted to protect their prerogatives, and now the political moment has passed, but it's a reminder that that wasn't a partisan issue until now. So this is significant to me for a couple of reasons. First, it suggests that there could be thoughtful agreement on meaningful structural reform, especially about the principles that I mentioned, and term limits is a bipartisan reform that everyone, including some of the justices, Justice Breyer says he's not opposed, especially because he's now retired, but it grandfathers in the current people. So these are all worth discussing. However, I am not persuaded by those on the left and the right who want to trash the Constitution and break up with it entirely. And we're seeing increasing rhetoric on this part by some liberal scholars who think the Constitution has failed and we have to break up with the founders and have an entirely new and purely majoritarian system, and by conservatives, by populists on the left and the right who want to trash the Constitution. And that's why I quoted that John Quincy language with such urgency. This is the one thing that holds Americans together. We do disagree strongly about its principles, as Americans did from the beginning. I found in my Hamilton Jefferson book, their basic debate between national power and states' rights, liberal and strict construction of the Constitution, and pure democracy versus rule by elites goes back to the debate over the bank and has defined our political parties and our constitutional debates ever since. But it's always the parties who reject the Constitution entirely who have tried to bring the system down, from John Calhoun and the defenders of slavery as a positive good to the demagogues who subverted Reconstruction and civil rights and said that the Constitution had to be reexamined. So I think it's a framework for debate. The Constitution is made for people of fundamentally differing points of view, as Justice Holmes said. It allows us to resolve our differences peaceably, lest violence result, and therefore, in addition to the reality, for better or for worse, that all of those reforms can't be passed without constitutional amendments, and therefore would require a form of secession to actually take place. We must hold and cleave to the Union and recognize that the framework of the Constitution and the rule of law itself as a means for peaceably resolving debate is all we've got.
Hi.
Hi.
Okay, doesn't sound like it. Oh, there it is. This summer, thank you so much for your talk, by the way. This is wonderful.
Thanks.
This summer, I happened upon a book that was in a local bookstore down Western Mass, wonderful little store, and it was right prominently displayed. It was called Iroquois Diplomacy. And I wonder if, because you're a scholar, and if you had ever come upon this book, because it was a revelation to me that there was a Huron chief, I believe in the 1600s, during the time that the French were colonizing indigenous territory at that time. And the Iroquois Federation, I think, had already formed. And this Huron chief, I believe, had written a scathing critique of Western culture. And apparently it made its way back to Europe and was hugely influential in Enlightenment thinking. And I can't give you any of the details, but we were in Canada last weekend and I happened upon this name in some place. And I said, oh, that's the man that wrote this critique. And when I was listening to so much of what you were saying, I was thinking of this critique that he, very lengthy, but it was essentially looking at this notion of the classics and this almost sort of Cartesian divide between emotion and reason. And I think part of his thinking was that's a false dichotomy. And, you know, so I'll stop there. But I wonder if you happened upon it yourself, and if not, check it out.
I will completely check it out. I haven't come across it. It sounds great. And the influence of the Iroquois Constitution on the U.S. Constitution is a totally fascinating topic that we did do a National Constitution Center town hall about recently, connected with Ned Blackhawk's great new book on the influence of Native American law throughout American history. It's kind of just won the National Book Award, and he discusses whether the Iroquois Constitution might have influenced the U.S. Constitution. Franklin and Jefferson knew of it, although and there are elements of separation of powers to it that look similar. And similarities and differences among Iroquois constitutionalism, and now you're inspiring me to learn about moral philosophy, would be deeply interesting to learn about. It's possible that the antithesis between reason and passion, which is not so unbridgeable in Enlightenment thought, I wouldn't be surprised if, like the consonance between the Eastern and Western focus on mental self-mastery and on mastering our thoughts. Perhaps we find some of that in the Iroquois traditions too, but the connection is totally fascinating. And it's I've just come back from South Dakota, just 2 days ago. I saw Mount Rushmore for the first time, which is so cool, as well as the Crazy Chief Memorial, which is the largest stone memorial in the world. And there's this new effulgence of interest in Native American law and Native American rights, led by Justice Neil Gorsuch, right now on the Supreme Court, is the leading defender of Native American rights. And we have so much to learn from that great tradition as well. I don't want to delay you too long. One more question, sure.
One more?
Let's see, this is a personal question to you. When you said you got started and you started to go to the origin of virtue and what its influence was in the Declaration of Independence, and then you said you yourself started to practice those virtues. And then you said, but after a while you gave up. So are you no longer virtuous?
I'm by definition not. But I did give up. That was 10 years ago, and I practiced the Franklin system, at the recommendation of a rabbi. And I found then, I was going through a hard time in my personal life, and there were all these X marks when I lost my temper and temperance and so forth, and it was hard to practice, I found, in that sort of self-accounting way. For me, I got back on the path through this project of deep reading, and just the daily habit of actually getting up, doing my reading, watching the sunrise, doing my reflections and sonnets, I came to experience as being back on the path and being on the quest. And that, reading the classical sources, helped me understand the Jewish wisdom in a way that I hadn't before. And I came to understand that the pursuit of happiness is indeed a spiritual quest. It's an attempt to connect with the divine harmonies of the universe. And as Pythagoras said, first be good and then be like a god. You try in your halting and imperfect way every day to become a little more perfect and a little self-mastered, and every day is a new day. So it's been a long quest full of reading and discovery, but for me, this reading was very meaningful in putting me back onto the quest of leading a spiritual life. I would love to talk more with you, and hope you'll get some books. So
Thank you, Jeffrey
for a
Rosen.
wonderful conversation. Thank you.
We'll be out front signing some books. Enjoy the rest of the festival.